Death is immediate. That's what the lore says. So someone explain why the Harlequin's kiss keeps getting called one of the most horrific methods of death in the 41st millennium. When, if death is immediate, there are plenty worse ways to go. That observation got 788 likes. Not for being provocative, not for trolling a content creator, for being the plainest correct statement in the thread. The video framed the kiss as horror, and the audience looked at the full scope of the 41st millennium and asked the only sensible follow-up question: compared to what? A rough count from that comment section: 49 visible comments out of 258 total, directional, not definitive, put somewhere between 55 and 60% of visible responses on the same side. The kiss kills fast. The galaxy does not. One commenter processed the full mechanical description of the weapon, took a breath, and wrote 7 words. Seems like an anti-nightmare. That got 223 likes, and it's the most economical correct analysis in the dataset. The community named the category. This is what the category actually means. Here is the thesis, stated once. The Harlequin's kiss produces a horrific event. The horror is genuine. Its address is the problem. It belongs to the person standing next to the casualty, not to the casualty. The weapon's mechanism ends the victim's experience before that experience can accumulate into the horror the observer is processing. In a universe with Necron Gauss flares stripping bodies atom by atom from the outside in while the nervous system is still functional, with Jukari homunculi who have spent 10,000 years constructing an entire civilization specifically around keeping organic captives functional and suffering, with tyrannid digestion pools that official lore documents keeping victims alive for several days, and with Nurgle's rot confirmed in the primary lore to slowly erode both soul and body simultaneously. In that universe, dying before you know what happened is the closest thing to luck on offer. The comparative ranking is the entire argument, and this is where the original video failed its audience and where the combined engagement was pointing. Start with the weapon itself, because the mechanism is where the thesis lives or dies. The Harlequin's kiss is a wrist-mounted close combat weapon, not a ranged projector, not something deployed from across a battlefield. You activate it by driving a spiked tip directly into a target. A punch with very specific engineering consequences. The moment that tip penetrates, a tightly coiled monofilament wire releases into the interior of the body. Warhammer Community, Games Workshop's own platform, the highest authority source available for this weapon's description, describes the mechanism in exact terms. The Harlequin's kiss contains a monofilament wire that unravels inside its victim, turning their insides into soup. That parenthetical they add, noting the Eldari would of course know nothing about soup, is its own species of dark humor, but the mechanism itself is documented cleanly. Monofilament wire, interior of the body, liquefaction. That is the primary source. Soup is the exact word they used. Secondary lore, from the Dark Heresy role-playing game, uses the word instantly to describe how the wire fills the body's interior after tip contact. The Games Workshop text doesn't use that word. It describes the result, not the duration. The community consensus treats the death as instantaneous, and that characterization is mechanically defensible. Monofilament wire deploying at high velocity through the enclosed space of a body's interior, with an extraordinary amount of cutting surface releasing simultaneously through a single entry point, produces comprehensive destruction of every soft structure inside, before any individual system can process what is happening. Instant is almost certainly accurate in practical terms. What matters for this comparison is that the lore presents no window of suffering, no documented conscious experience of damage accumulating. The death is the event. The event concludes before the victim has fully understood that the event began. The wire length, both the Warhammer 40K fandom wiki and Lexicanum, place it at around 100 meters, coiled into a wrist-mounted device. Neither cites a specific codex page for that figure, so it carries the caveat that it's community-accepted secondary sourcing rather than a confirmed codex specification. What the figure illustrates, whatever the precise number, is the engineering logic. an extraordinary ratio of cutting surface to delivery mechanism deployed through a single entry wound. One small hole, everything simultaneously. The Harlequin's kiss is also not the only weapon operating on this principle. Lexicanum's monofilament weaponry entry lists at least 7 distinct weapons in the category: the Harlequin's embrace, the kiss, the Death Weaver, the Death Shroud Cannon, the Doom Weaver, the Death Spinner, and the Monoball Grenade. These span melee, close range, and artillery applications. The December 2024 Eldari Index PDF describes the Doom Weaver, the weapon mounted on the Night Spinner artillery platform, as spinning great swathes of monofilament wire into a lethal web that is launched high into the air. Same underlying principle, entirely different deployment architecture. The Kiss is an intimate single-target punch weapon. The Doom Weaver throws an airborne wire net at artillery range to cover an entire section of battlefield. Monofilament is a recognized Eldari weapons doctrine, with multiple applications across melee and ranged categories, not a quirk specific to one weapon. The Kiss is the doctrine's most famous expression and the one most associated with the horror framing, but it sits inside a broader category of confirmed monofilament weapons. One flavor note on the faction: Harlequins are Eldari warriors in service of Segurok, the Laughing God, and the Kiss fits their aesthetic: intimate, precise, conclusive. That is the flavor sentence. The mythology is rich. The community's engagement data is equally clear that the weapons mechanics and the comparative death ranking are where the interest lives. The roughly 40 to 45% of visible commenters who held the still horrific position were answering a genuine question correctly. One of them put it plainly: stand next to someone hit by this thing and tell me the word horrific doesn't apply. They're right. The word applies. What the Harlequin's kiss produces, externally and visibly, is the sudden and catastrophic failure of everything inside a human body in a fraction of a second. The observer standing a meter away sees that failure. Whatever the visual presentation of internal soft tissue liquefaction is, and the Games Workshop parenthetical about soup isn't an innocent word choice, the witness accounts will use the same adjective every time, because horrific is accurate for what the observer has just processed. The people holding this position weren't wrong. They were answering a different question than the one the 788 like comment was asking. The question those 788 likes were asking: is the kiss horrific for the person it's happening to? That's the question with a different answer. Most deaths, in most contexts, give the observer and the victim the same information. A prolonged, painful death is experienced as suffering by the victim and witnessed as suffering by anyone present. A fast, clean death is experienced as quick by the victim and witnessed as quick. The alignment between the two perspectives is normal. The Harlequin's kiss breaks that alignment structurally. It produces an observer experience of spectacular horror while delivering to the victim, by the lore's implication, an exit that concludes before the nervous system completes its first damage report. The observer and the victim are having entirely different experiences of the same event. That decoupling is the feature. It's also exactly why the comparative argument matters so much, because the question, is the kiss horrific, returns different answers depending entirely on which side of the wound you are asking from. The anti-nightmare is the right term for this category of thing. A horror visible from outside that doesn't reach the person it's happening to. Now here's what the kiss looks like when placed against what the 41st millennium actually offers. The necrons have been dormant for 60 million years in some cases, sealed in tomb complexes across thousands of worlds, waiting out the universe in stasis. The race that built them, the Necron tier, traded their organic forms for immortal metal bodies in a pact with star god entities called the Catan, and the weapon they carry out of that transformation is the Gauss Flayer. Standard issue for Necron warriors, the basic infantry unit, carried by every rank and file soldier in every Necron force currently reawakening across the galaxy. It isn't a specialized torture instrument. It isn't a weapon of last resort. It's the default, the ordinary, the thing a basic Necron warrior points at you the same way an Imperial Guardsman points a laser gun. The Gauss flare does not shoot projectiles in any conventional sense. It fires a green-tinged energy discharge that interacts with matter at the atomic level, disrupting the bonds that hold it together. The fandom wiki's description is specific. It can strip a target down to nothing molecule by molecule, reducing it to its constituent atoms. The mechanism involves the weapon pulsing with intense electrical currents that generate powerful magnetic fields, and those magnetic fields strip the target's constituent atoms from their molecular bonds. The Steam community citation, drawing from the same lore body, adds the summary view. The blast shears apart the target's atomic bonds, literally stripping their bodies apart atom by atom and molecule by molecule. It isn't combustion. It isn't impact. It's the selective disruption of the forces holding matter together, applied progressively to whatever the beam contacts. That word, progressively, is carrying most of the weight in this comparison. The Gauss flare strips from the outside in. It encounters the outermost layer of whatever is in front of it first, disrupts those atomic bonds, and the material dematerializes. Then the layer beneath, then the layer beneath that. The name flare isn't incidental. It describes the mechanism accurately. Armor first, then the tissue beneath it, then the structures beneath that. Bone before organs. The Gauss flare reaches the brain only after it has processed everything between the weapon and the brain, which for a standing human target is the full depth of the body. The brain isn't the first structure the weapon contacts. It's among the last. The official lore includes one detail that closes the structural argument. Victims die as much from shock as the damage caused by the beams. Shock is a physiological cascade. Plummeting blood pressure, cellular oxygen deprivation, system failure, that requires a functioning nervous system to execute. You enter shock because your body is registering catastrophic damage and attempting an emergency response. The brain and spinal column are interior structures. The Gauss flare's progressive mechanism works through every exterior layer before reaching them, which means there is a window between the weapon firing and the moment neural function ends, a window during which the victim is physiologically registering what is happening to them, aware enough for the shock response to begin, present while the stripping proceeds inward from the surface. The lore does not assign that window a specific duration in seconds. What can be stated from the mechanism alone is that the window exists. Layer by layer, atom by atom, from outside to inside, does not describe a process that concludes at the same moment it begins. The brain isn't the entry point, it's the destination. One claim from the original discussion worth correcting: the assertion that Gauss weapons are made to inflict as much pain as possible as deliberate design intent. The official lore doesn't support that framing cleanly. The pain is described as an unavoidable consequence of the atomic disruption mechanism, not the stated purpose of the weapon's design. The Gauss flare was engineered to destroy matter, to strip atomic bonds and dematerialize whatever is in front of it. That this process is documented as, supposedly, extremely painful, is a function of what progressive molecular dismantling does to a living organism, not a design specification the Necron tier built toward. The name carries obvious semantic weight, and the community has long read deliberate intent into it. But the primary lore frames the pain as incidental to the destructive function, rather than the function's purpose. Whether the suffering was intended or incidental makes no practical difference to the victim experiencing it. It does, however, matter for the comparison. The Gauss flare is horrible because of what it is, not because it was specifically optimized to be horrible. The distinction between those two things will matter when we reach the Drukhari. The Harlequin's kiss, by contrast, does not strip from the outside in. It breaches from a single entry point and deploys cutting surface throughout the entire interior simultaneously. The lore describes a result, soup, that indicates the mechanism has already concluded. The Gauss flare performs a staged dismantling. The kiss performs an event. For the victim, that difference is the entire difference. The Drukari case requires a different analytical framework because with the Gauss flare, the suffering is a side effect of the weapon's function. With the Drukari, prolonged suffering is the function. The distinction is structural, not a matter of degree. The Drukari live in Camera, a pocket dimension constructed within the webway, the dimension between dimensions that Eldari civilization used for faster-than-light travel across the galaxy. Unlike the craft-world Eldari, the Drukari have no access to the infinity circuit, the collective Eldari psychic space that binds and preserves souls after death, and no spirit stone technology to protect individual souls while alive. What stands between a Drukari and having their soul consumed by Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess born from the collective psychic cataclysm of the Eldari's fall, is the regular intake of harvested pain, anguish, and suffering from outside victims. Not as cultural preference, not as decadence layered on top of a functioning civilization, as metabolism, as survival. The pain feed is what keeps the soul viable against Slaanesh's constant hunger. The confirmation of this isn't abstract theology. Drukari who have ended up in imperial captivity die within days, apparently of nothing visible. Their bodies fail because the soul is atrophying without the intake that keeps it functional. The mechanism works in reverse as evidence. Remove a Drukari from access to pain, and they die from soul starvation. That metabolic reality is what makes the torture infrastructure not just present in Drukari civilization, but foundational to it. The flesh laboratories aren't a symptom of the culture. They are its cardiovascular system. The homunculi are the civilization's primary engineers of that system. Their official faction designation is Lords of Pain. The official wiki describes them as horrific and insane Drukari flesh sculptors who have lived within the depths of Camorra. That is the canonical description of what they are, not a community characterization. They operate flesh laboratories. They have developed, over 10,000 years of practice since the fall of the Eldari, a comprehensive toolkit for keeping organic captives alive, conscious, and functionally experiencing their situation for as long as the homunculus conducting the procedure considers productive. The documented methods span the biological and the psychological in tandem. Chemical modification alters the biochemistry of a captive, heightening sensory reception, reducing the body's natural buffering systems against pain, extending the physiological capacity to survive damage that would normally be fatal. Surgical modification runs parallel to the chemical work, restructuring the body for sustained endurance of conditions it was never designed to endure. The homunculi don't simply damage a subject and observe. They rebuild the subject to receive more. The psychological dimension is arguably the most sophisticated element of their methodology. What their documentation describes is the systematic deployment of false hope, constructing conditions under which the captive genuinely believes recovery or escape is possible, allowing that belief to develop into expectation, and then destroying it with precision. The suffering quality that comes from despair following genuine expectation is richer, more intense, metabolically more useful than simple, unrelenting pain. Beyond that general technique, the homunculi exploit what they learn about each specific individual, their particular fears, their specific ambitions, the precise emotional attachments that make the loss of hope most acute for that subject specifically. It isn't a generic template applied uniformly. It's custom engineering applied to each captive's individual psychology, derived from study of that individual. The captive's own internal life becomes the weapon used against them. The Talos pain engine provides the clearest physical evidence of the homunculi's foundational engineering orientation. It's now a battlefield unit fielded in Drukari combat forces, a primary weapon platform used in open war. It was first constructed as a torture device. That origin is explicit in the lore, not subtext or implication. An entire primary battlefield weapon platform for one of the 41st millennium's major factions began its existence as a tool for maximizing the suffering of captives in a flesh laboratory, and was then adapted to open combat when the homunculi realized the torture architecture was effective at other scales. The torture origin isn't historical color. It's the statement that, for the homunculi, torture engineering and warfare engineering are the same discipline pursued across different operational contexts. The homunculi can also restore dead Drukhari to function using soul traps, that is, in the canonical lore. If they can return the dead to functional existence, maintaining living captives well beyond normal biological limits is well within the demonstrated range of their tools. The confirmed canonical duration for Dark Eldar captivity runs through days, weeks, and months. The specific upper bound, whether captivity extends into years, is where primary sources trail off and community extrapolation begins. So, months is the confirmed floor, and indefinite extension is technically possible, is the accurate framing of the capability. But the floor is months. Months inside a flesh laboratory run by engineers who have spent 10,000 years refining the specific craft of keeping you functional and suffering. The confirmed floor. This isn't a matter of degree relative to the other entries in this ranking. The Gauss flare produces a window of consciousness measured in the mechanism's own progressive logic. The Tyranid digestion pool produces several days. The Drukhari system produces months as the confirmed minimum, with the technical capability to extend it further explicitly established in the lore. The gap between the Kiss and Drukhari captivity isn't measured in a larger number on the same scale. The Kiss removes you from time. The Drukhari weaponize time itself against you. Those aren't comparable positions on a shared spectrum. The 62-like comment called it being a Dark Eldar's ritualistic torture meatbag. The official lore confirms every detail that description implies. The Tyranids present the comparison with the strongest direct documentation in the dataset, and the document is blunt enough that extended analysis is almost redundant. The hive mind is a collective intelligence unlike anything else in the 41st millennium. It has no individual psychology, no hatred, no cruelty in any sense the word implies. It processes the galaxy's matter as a resource, biomass, to be consumed, reclaimed, and repurposed for the production of more Tyranid organisms. Individual organisms caught in a Tyranid advance aren't victims of malice. They are biomass that hasn't yet been processed. The distinction matters not at all to the organisms being processed, but it matters enormously for the comparison, because the horror the Tyranids produce is entirely without intent and entirely without limit. There is no design philosophy of suffering at work. There is simply biological machinery operating on conscious organisms, and the machinery wasn't built with consciousness in mind because consciousness isn't a relevant variable when your operational goal is biomass reclamation. The reclamation pools are the industrial infrastructure of that processing. Organic matter enters the pools. Enzymatic action begins breaking it down into constituent nutrients for Tyranid use. The Warhammer 40K fandom wiki's description of this process states directly that victims are digested alive for several days. That is the primary lore. Several days. Not minutes. Not hours. Days, plural, with the word alive present in the sentence. What follows that detail in the source is worth examining closely. The phrase, despite being blind. The phrasing is specific. The source isn't saying all sensory systems fail simultaneously. It's specifying blindness as a particular condition that occurs during the process, which implies that other sensory and nervous systems aren't assumed to share that fate. The visual system is compromised. Hearing, proprioception, and, most relevantly, the nerve network that reports tissue damage to the brain remain, by the implication of the source's specific construction, functional for some additional period. You lose the capacity to see what is dissolving around you. You retain the capacity to feel it. Magos biologist Salk, compiling an in-universe imperial record on Tyranid biomorphs and bioweapons, documented the full scope of the Tyranid bioweapon ecosystem: paralytic compounds, acid projectors, purpose-bred organisms used as delivery mechanisms. These are functional adaptations, not expressions of cruelty, evolved across timescales that dwarf the Imperium's recorded history. The suffering isn't the point. Efficient biomass extraction is the point. The suffering is simply what happens when biological processing machinery operates on a living nervous system that is still registering input. The 88-like comment, the highest engagement comparative claim in the visible section of that thread, stated a preference for the KISS over any Tyranid or Nurgle weapon. The Tyranid half of that preference rests entirely on the several days figure and what it means in practice. Several days inside a biological processing environment, blind, with the remainder of the nervous system intact, being dissolved. The hive mind does not know you are experiencing this. There is no witness. The reclamation infrastructure is inside hive ships, processing biomass with the same indifference a digestion tract processes a meal. The experience is yours alone for those several days, unshared and entirely unregistered by anything around you. Place the KISS next to this directly. On one side, monofilament wire deploying at high velocity through organic soft tissue, liquefaction. The lore describing a result rather than a duration, no documented window of conscious experience. On the other, several days, alive, blind, dissolving. Both end in death. What separates them is every second between the wound and that conclusion, and one of them has several days of those seconds confirmed in primary lore, and the other has none. Nurgle stands apart from the others in this comparison, and the reason is actually the most analytically interesting part of the ranking. The chaos god of decay, plague, and entropy operates through corruption rather than violence. His blessing to followers is biological transformation. The body changes, rots, becomes a carrier and spreader of disease, and the bearer spreads that entropy to everything in proximity. The signature plague of his domain, Nurgle's rot, is confirmed in official lore to slowly erode a victim's soul as well as their body. That word, slowly, is the essential one. This isn't a rapid event. The physical transformation is progressive, measured in days and weeks at minimum, and the soul erosion runs in parallel throughout the entire process. The soul component requires precise treatment because in Warhammer 40K cosmology, the soul isn't a metaphor for personhood or psychological identity. It's a real metaphysical entity that exists within the cosmological framework of the setting, that chaos powers interact with as material, that the warp is literally constructed from. When Nurgle's rot erodes a victim's soul, that description isn't poetic language for psychological damage. It's describing the actual degradation of a real thing that exists in this universe and can be damaged, consumed, and lost. The victim is losing something the primary lore treats as genuinely there to be lost, and they are losing it gradually while remaining conscious alongside progressive physical decay. The Gauss flare strips the body. The Drukhari torture the body and exploit the psychology. The Tyranid pool dissolves the body. Nurgle's rot degrades both body and soul simultaneously, slowly, with the victim present throughout the entire process. For devoted followers of Nurgle, the experience includes a feature that complicates every comparison this script has made so far. Their decay is received as a gift. The lore is consistent that his followers experience their corruption as blessing and appear genuinely to feel it that way, not merely as psychological damage from the corruption, but as something Nurgle provides alongside the rot itself. Whether that experience is genuine in any meaningful sense, or is itself a function of what the corruption does to perception, is deliberately left ambiguous in the lore. His followers are visibly deteriorating. Their followers are apparently not distressed by this in the way anyone observing them would expect. The observer has access to more horror than the follower does. For unwilling recipients, a soldier hit with Nurgle's rot who chose no allegiance to chaos, who has no ideological framework to receive biological transformation as anything other than what it is. That pattern reverses entirely. The rot is still slow. The soul erosion is still occurring. The physical decay is still progressive and visible. But there is nothing in the mechanism that introduces the euphoric component for someone who didn't choose the path. What the follower receives as transformation, the unwilling victim receives as exactly what it appears to be: their body deteriorating around them, their soul being progressively eroded, and both processes unfolding gradually enough that they have time to understand what is happening at each stage and to understand that it will continue. Nurgle's power in the immaterium also grows with every organism that rots under his influence. The spread of his corruption isn't incidental to his nature as a chaos god. It's the mechanism by which he expands. Every unwilling victim of Nurgle's rot isn't just suffering. They are actively contributing to his growth in the warp while they suffer. The rot radiates outward. What was one person's experience becomes, through the plague's spread, an expanding sphere of the same slow erosion applied to more and more organisms. The Chaos God is fed and enlarged by this process. The victim is, while they live, a production mechanism for his power, whether they choose to be or not. The Nurgle comparison also produces the ranking's most structurally interesting reversal of the observer-victim problem this script has been tracking. With the Gauss flare, the victim's experience is worse than the observer's. The observer sees the stripping, the victim is the stripping. With the Drukhari, the horror is conducted mostly in enclosed flesh laboratories. The observer doesn't witness most of it. With the Tyranid pool, there is no witness at all for the majority of the duration. The reclamation infrastructure is inside hive ships. With Nurgle's devoted followers, the asymmetry runs opposite to all of these. The observer has access to more apparent horror than the follower, who may be experiencing something quite different from what their physical state suggests. For unwilling recipients, that asymmetry flips again, and the victim's experience becomes the full version of what the observer sees, without the buffer that makes the follower apparently indifferent to their own transformation. Both versions, devoted follower and unwilling recipient, are worse than anything the kiss delivers to either party in the encounter. The follower's experience is ambiguous and possibly subjectively tolerable, but it's slow, extended, and physically comprehensive. The unwilling recipient's experience removes the ambiguity and leaves the slow erosion fully visible to the person experiencing it. The Drukhari occupy their own category above everything else in this ranking, separated not by degree but by structural kind. The confirmed canonical floor is months, with indefinite extension capability established in the lore. The horror of Drukhari captivity isn't measured in the intensity of any given moment. Moments can be compared on a scale. It's measured in the total optimized span of custom-engineered suffering applied to a subject whose biological continuation has been specifically ensured by people who have been refining this specific craft for 10,000 years. That structural optimization for sustained suffering is the feature that places Drukhari captivity outside the scale the other entries share. Tyranid digestion and Nurgle's rot occupy the tier below that. Several days of confirmed conscious digestion against the slow dual erosion of body and soul over days, weeks, and longer. Comparable in confirmed duration, comparable in the absence of any exit before the process concludes. The Tyranid pool has the more precise primary lore documentation. Nurgle's rot has the broader damage category, reaching the soul alongside the body. Whether conscious dissolution in a digestion pool or the gradual parallel erosion of body and soul constitutes the worse fate for the victim is genuinely arguable. Both are vastly worse than what follows in the ranking. The Gauss flare occupies the middle. Progressive stripping, consciousness implied by the shock death mechanism, the brain last rather than first, no confirmed duration, but a mechanism that structurally can't produce instantaneous shutdown. Clearly worse for the victim than the kiss, clearly less sustained than the tier above. The gap between the Gauss flare and the kiss is real and grounded in the mechanism's basic description. The gap between the Gauss flare and Drukari captivity is larger still. The Harlequin's kiss sits at the other end of this ranking. A single entry wound, monofilament wire deploying simultaneously through the body's interior. Liquefaction. The official description is the result, not the process, because the process is fast enough that it may not meaningfully exist as a separate event from the result. No documented window of suffering, no confirmed duration of conscious experience. The victim is almost certainly not present by the time the damage is fully expressed. That is, by the standards of everything else in this ranking, the closest thing to a clean exit available in the 41st millennium. Return to the bystander question one more time, because it earns its place here. The original framing, the kiss as most horrific, was doing what any honest observer would do. Assign the horror you are witnessing to the person you are watching. That logic holds in nearly every other context. Most deaths give both parties the same information, and the distinction between observer horror and victim horror is fine enough to collapse without losing anything important. In the 41st millennium, that collapse fails specifically for the kiss, because the lore is precise enough to preserve the distinction in a way most deaths don't allow. The official Games Workshop text describes a result, soup, that indicates the mechanism has concluded when the result is visible. The result is horrific for the observer. The process that produced it wasn't experienced by the person it happened to, at least not at any length the lore documents. The observer and the victim parted company at the moment the kiss deployed, and everything the observer processes afterward belongs entirely to the observer. The Black Library novel featuring the Harlequin character Motley includes a passage describing the kiss being used in close combat. The narrative is written from outside the victim's experience, which isn't an artistic choice so much as a structural constraint, because there is no inside the victim's experience to write from. The event is over before a perspective can form. The lore consistently describes the kiss from the bystander's point of view, because that is the only point of view the lore has access to. The victim's absence from the subjective account is itself the data. Every other weapon in this comparison set produces a victim's eye perspective that the lore can access, because the victim is present long enough to have one. Gauss flare victims have time to register shock. Drukari captives have months. Tyranid pool victims have several days. Nurgle's unwilling recipients have the slow accumulation of understanding what is happening to them across an extended and documented process. All of these durations produce a perspective. All of those perspectives are horrific. The kiss, by the lore's implication, produces none, not because the event isn't real, but because the event concludes before a perspective can form and persist. The horror belongs to the kiss completely. It belongs specifically to the observer. This isn't a dismissal of that horror. Observer horror is real. The witness's experience is genuine, and horrific is the right word for what someone standing next to a kiss casualty is processing. The problem is the attribution, not the emotion. The horror is being attributed to the dead when the evidence suggests it belongs to the living. The grim darkness of the far future earned that descriptor because every major structural system running the 41st millennium depends, in some way, on suffering as load-bearing material. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes interstellar navigation possible for the Imperium, is maintained by psychers burning themselves out in continuous service to the Emperor's psychic projection. Chaos grows stronger as the sentient beings of the galaxy generate the emotional extremes the ruinous powers feed on. The Necrons carry as basic infantry equipment a weapon that strips bodies atom by atom while the victim registers the process. The Tyranids need organic biomass and have evolved biology that processes it with victims alive inside for several days. The Drukari need pain and have constructed an entire pocket dimension of civilization infrastructure specifically to produce it sustainably. Nurgle's power in the Immaterium expands with every organism that rots under his influence. This isn't a universe with pockets of horror surrounded by normalcy. The horror is structural. It's how the place runs. In a universe built that way, the default outcome for an organism caught in any significant conflict isn't a clean death. The factions with the highest structural investment in suffering, the Drukhari, the Tyranids, the Gauss-carrying Necrons, Nurgle's forces, either need the suffering, produce it incidentally, or represent an entropy expressed as prolonged biological failure that keeps the nervous system functional and reporting for longer than anyone would choose. Dying quickly, in this context, isn't the expectation, it's the exception. Most of what the galaxy offers keeps you present longer than you want to be present. The Harlequin's kiss kills efficiently and rapidly because efficient and rapid killing is what the weapon was designed to produce. The mercy is the side effect. Side effects don't change the ranking. The commenter who wrote, "Seems like an anti-nightmare," ran exactly the right analytical process in 7 words. They read the description, looked at the 41st millennium, ran the comparison, and categorized correctly. The anti-nightmare is a real category, a thing that appears, from the outside, to be horror, while the person inside the experience exits before the horror can fully form. In this galaxy, with this comparison set, the Harlequin's kiss is the canonical example. Not because monofilament wire is gentle, not because the weapon is a kindness, not because dying this way is good, because turning the inside into soup rapidly and digested alive for several days and months in a homunculus flesh laboratory aren't equivalent events for the person they happen to, and the lore is specific enough to prove the distinction without requiring inference. The original framing called the kiss most horrific. Most of the comment section disagreed, correctly, and one of them named the category correctly on the first attempt. The lore confirms the verdict. The word horrific belongs to the weapon. The horror belongs to the witness. In the 41st millennium, if you have to choose a last moment, and in the 41st millennium, that choice isn't usually yours to make. Dying before your nervous system files its report isn't the worst available option. By a very significant margin, it's one of the better ones. Plenty worse ways to die. The kiss isn't close to the top of that list. Subscribe. There's more coming.